Welcome to Dr. Isha and Arya's Deep Dish Dialogue. All right, let's jump right into this deep dive. Today we're tackling a thought experiment. You probably heard of the trolley problem.
Ah, yes, the classic.
Exactly. But we're looking beyond just the philosophy classroom puzzle today.
Yeah.
We've gathered, a whole stack of sources, articles, research, different viewpoints.
A real mix.
Yeah, to really understand how this old dilemma gives us some crucial insight into, some really tough real-world decisions.
The kind we see all the time.
Right. So our mission here is to unpack these sources, pull out the most important bits, and see what this problem tells us about choices in, say, medicine, government, even just our daily lives. Why are these decisions just so hard? Let's get into it.
Sounds good. And it's fascinating, isn't it, how a seemingly simple scenario, which Philippa Foot first explored and Judith Jarvis Thomson later refined, how it opens up such deep questions about morality. So you've got this runaway trolley, right?
Yep, out of control.
Hurtling down the track towards 5 people. They're stuck.
Tied down, usually in the thought experiment. Grim stuff.
Very. And you happen to be standing by a lever. If you do nothing, the trolley hits the 5. They die.
Okay.
But if you pull the lever, the trolley switches tracks. The problem is there's one person tied to that other track. Pull the lever, that one person dies, but the 5 are saved.
That's a brutal choice, isn't it? 5 lives versus 1. You immediately feel pulled in, 2 different moral directions.
Absolutely. And this is where the sources really highlight that core conflict between 2 major ways of thinking ethically.
Okay, what are they?
Well, first there's utilitarianism. This view focuses purely on the outcome. The goal is the greatest good for the greatest number.
Simple math, kind of.
Sort of. From that perspective, pulling the lever seems like the way to go. Save 5 lives by sacrificing 1. You maximize the overall good. The focus is all on the consequence.
So the act of pulling the lever itself isn't the issue, it's the net result. More lives saved.
Precisely. But then you contrast that with deontology.
Okay.
This framework emphasizes moral duties, rules. Think do not kill.
Ah, right. A fundamental rule.
Exactly. So from a deontological viewpoint, pulling that lever means you are actively causing the death of that one person. That's a violation of the rule.
Even though not acting leads to more deaths.
Yes, because by not acting, you haven't directly violated that do not kill rule yourself. The focus shifts to the rightness or wrongness of the action itself, not just the final body count.
And that's why it feels so agonizing. Are you a murderer if you pull the lever, even to save 5?
Or are you morally responsible if you don't act when you could have stopped a bigger tragedy?
Yeah. Where does the guilt lie? In acting, or in failing to act? The sources really dig into these gut feelings.
They do, because our intuitions often don't fit neatly into just one box, We feel differently about actively causing harm versus just letting something happen.
Okay, so the key insight from this classic setup is really about forcing us to face these fundamental, sometimes conflicting ways we judge right and wrong. Is it the result or the action itself?
Exactly. It boils it down to that core tension. But now let's shift gears quite dramatically.
Okay.
Because some of the sources we looked at take this whole dilemma outside of that traditional Western philosophy framework. They examine it through the lens of Indigenous Australian worldviews.
Oh, interesting. How does that change things?
Well, it's a profound shift. In many Aboriginal frameworks, you wouldn't necessarily start with, what should I do, as an isolated individual at the lever.
Right.
You'd immediately place the situation within a much, much bigger context. Relationships, responsibilities, connection to country, the whole interconnected web.
So less about the immediate choice, more about the whole picture.
Yes. The first question might even be something like, why are people on the tracks in the first place?
Questioning the system that led to the crisis, not just the crisis moment itself.
Precisely. It's not just about counting lives like in simple utilitarianism. It's about maintaining harmony with the land, with spirit, with the community. The moral calculation isn't just arithmetic. It's deeply relational.
How does this decision affect kinship? What are the long-term spiritual consequences? Intergenerational responsibility, that kind of thing.
Exactly. The sources talk about concepts like law, these overarching customary and spiritual principles, and relationality. Who are these people? What are their roles, their connections, their ties to the land?
And custodial responsibility. That duty to maintain balance, care for people and place, recognizing the spiritual weight of causing death, the potential need for ceremony?
Yes, and a kind of long-term consequentialism that stretches across generations, tied into dreaming narratives and ongoing duties.
So an Aboriginal perspective might not give a simple pull or don't pull answer.
Probably not a universal one. The right decision would likely depend hugely on the specifics. Who are these individuals? What's their relationship to country, to each other, to the person making the decision?
Yeah.
It demands a really deep, contextual, embodied wisdom. It moves way beyond a detached, abstract calculation.
So the insight here is that some worldviews don't see these as isolated puzzles for individuals, but as complex challenges embedded in relationships, systems, long-term responsibilities, shifting focus from just the immediate outcome to the whole web.
That relational view is crucial, and it actually connects to another powerful idea from the sources, the role of the agent. What happens the moment you become aware, standing there, able to act?
You're not just watching anymore, you're part of it.
Exactly. The argument in some sources is that awareness plus capacity equals agency. You've entered a new moral reality, you have power, and with that comes responsibility.
So the idea that doing nothing is just preserving the status quo, that gets challenged.
Massively challenged. Inaction, when you can intervene, is presented as a choice, a form of action with foreseeable consequences, just like pulling the lever.
You're actively choosing not to pull it in that moment.
Yes. And the probability argument comes in here, highlighting this moral shift. Before you showed up, maybe the 5 were likely to die, sure, but the chance of the one person on the sidetrack dying from this specific threat was basically 0.
Right, the trolley wasn't heading their way initially.
Exactly. Once you're at the lever, you change those probabilities. Your inaction keeps the probability high for the 5, 0 for the 1. Your action flips it. You can't really compare it to a world where you weren't there to justify doing nothing now that you are there. Your presence creates a new decision tree.
So you can't use the "what if I wasn't here" argument. The real comparison is between I'm here and I act versus I'm here and I don't act. That's the comparison fallacy they mentioned.
Precisely that. Once you have agency, inaction isn't morally neutral ground. So the key insight is just being aware and able to act makes you an agent. Your choices, including inaction, are morally loaded acts that shape what happens next.
Okay, this adds layers. Because things get even more complicated, maybe more realistic, when you start adding new information about who is on the tracks.
Oh, absolutely. What if the sources post scenarios like the 5 are convicted criminals and the 1 is a young child?
Oh, yeah.
Or the 1 person is a brilliant cancer researcher about to find a cure? Or a pregnant woman? Or your own family member?
Suddenly the abstract numbers game just dissolves, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You're weighing not just quantity of life, but perceived quality, potential, personal connection.
Exactly. And this really shows the limits of those purely abstract ethical rules. Our biases, our relationships, our society's values about who matters more, they all rush in.
How do you weigh the life of a child versus an elder? Or someone seen as useful versus someone not? It's uncomfortable fast.
It does. And the sources note that scenarios involving a villain or someone vulnerable, like a child, an elder, someone from a historically disadvantaged group, bring in totally different factors. Justice, fairness, a duty to protect.
Which resonates a bit with that Indigenous perspective you mentioned about the value of elders or children.
It can, yes. It highlights how real-world moral problems are just soaked in context and values. The insight here is that specific humanizing information fundamentally changes the dilemma. It forces us to confront our own biases and shows how abstract principles often buckle under the weight of real lives and relationships.
So, taking all these layers, the outcome focus, the action focus, the relational context, our own agency, the specific information, how does this play out? Because these aren't just thought experiments. These trolleys are running in the real world all the time.
They absolutely are. The trolley problem is such a durable framework precisely because it mirrors these agonizing decisions we see constantly.
Like in hospitals. That seems like an obvious place.
Definitely. Healthcare professionals face trolley dilemmas constantly. Think about triage in a mass casualty event, a bombing, a natural disaster, a pandemic surge.
Right, limited resources.
Exactly. Doctors with only so many ventilators, ICU beds, or even just time have to make impossible choices. Who gets the life-saving care when not everyone can? They are the agents at the lever. Deciding who gets treatment and who might not is a form of pulling the lever or letting the trolley continue.
And that new information is crucial there. Patient history, prognosis, age, likelihood of survival, it all factors into those incredibly fraught decisions.
Precisely. They're navigating utility, trying to save the most lives alongside their duty to each individual patient, all within the specific context. Organ allocation is another stark one.
Yeah.
Complex criteria decide who gets a life-saving organ when there aren't enough to go around. Explicit choices are made to prioritize some lives over others based on a range of factors.
And beyond the hospital walls, the sources mention geopolitics too.
Yes, nations face similar stark choices, deciding whether to intervene in a foreign conflict, for instance.
Pulling the lever.
Kind of. A nation might choose to act, potentially sacrificing its own soldiers or resources, the one to protect allies, prevent genocide, or stop aggression, the five. The justification often involves weighing outcomes or perceived duties.
And staying out, not pulling the lever.
That's also a choice with huge consequences, especially for powerful nations. Remember, the agency and probability arguments. Inaction isn't neutral. If an aggressor goes unchecked, not intervening can lead to far greater suffering down the line.
So intelligence, history, the perceived nature of the regimes involved, that's all new information shaping these global decisions.
Absolutely. Even something like trade sanctions fits the model imposing economic hardship, the one on a population hoping for a greater long-term good, the five, like changing a regime's behavior on human rights or proliferation.
And bringing it right home, the sources pointed to current debates in Australia, like migration policies and specifically international student caps.
Yes, this is framed as a very real contemporary trolley problem. Restrictive migration policies can be seen as protecting those already in the country, the perceived five, from pressures on housing, infrastructure, etc.
Well, the one, or maybe many ones, are the potential migrants or refugees denied entry or opportunity.
Right. And Australia, having the capacity to set these policies, is clearly the agent here, shaping outcomes. The choice isn't passive.
And the international student cap debate, which the sources note was very active around late May 2025.
Is a perfect example of a deliberate intervention, a policy lever pull.
So what were the arguments for the caps, looking through this trolley lens?
Well, the arguments for capping often center on protecting the five Australian residents. The big concern highlighted is the pressure large numbers of international students place on the domestic housing market, making it harder and more expensive for locals to find places to live.
Okay, so easing pressure on locals.
Yeah, and also managing strain on things like public transport, maybe healthcare, and some argue ensuring education quality isn't diluted for domestic students if classes get too large or resources stretched.
So pulling the lever, in this view, protects the current inhabitants from negative consequences.
That's the framing. And the arguments against caps, or for keeping intake high, they tend to focus on the benefits brought by the one, the students themselves, and also broader benefits to the five, meaning Australia overall.
What kind of benefits?
Huge economic contributions. For one, fees, living expenses. They fill critical skill shortages in the workforce. There's soft power, global connections. Plus, their fees are a major funding source for universities, supporting research and operations that benefit everyone. And for the student, it's often a life-changing opportunity.
So capping intake isn't a neutral act. It's a deliberate intervention with significant knock-on effects for the students who can't come, for the economy, for the universities. And new information like economic data, housing impact studies, skill needs, that's constantly shaping this debate too.
Absolutely. It forces these really difficult trade-offs, weighing different kinds of value and consequence against each other.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. What's the big picture takeaway from this deep dive into the trolley problem and all these sources?
I think it's that the trolley problem is so much more than just a philosophical brain teaser. It's a really powerful lens, a useful tool for examining incredibly difficult ethical choices pretty much everywhere in life, where harm seems unavoidable or resources are limited.
And to really grasp it, we need to look beyond just that initial 5 versus 1 calculation.
Yeah.
We need the utilitarian outcome view, yes, but also the deontological action view.
And crucially, the relational and systemic perspectives, like those from Indigenous worldviews. Plus, understanding our own agency that we become involved once we know and can act, and the massive role of specific human context, that new information.
Yeah. It pushes us past simple math towards thinking about relationships, long-term consequences, our active role, and the values and biases we inevitably bring. That probability point really sticks too once you can act. Even doing nothing is a choice with weight.
It is. And as new information keeps coming in, the moral landscape shifts constantly. Facing these dilemmas takes more than just sharp intellect. It requires, well, wisdom, empathy, and a real sense of responsibility for this interconnected world we're part of.
The trolley seems abstract, but the levers, in so many different forms, are definitely real, and they're often in our hands.
It certainly leaves you with a lot to think about.
It really does. Which leads to maybe one final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. If just having the capacity to act makes us agents, and inaction itself is a choice with consequences, how do we figure out when we have a moral duty to intervene in crises we see happening, maybe far away, even if we didn't directly cause them? Thank you for joining this deep dive into the trolley problem. We hope exploring these sources gives you a richer sense of why these dilemmas are so tough and so relevant. Help us reach more people by subscribing to the channel and liking the video. See you in the next